Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
My name's Marshall Crane, and at 56 years old, I can still feel the echo of that night nearly 2 decades ago when the house went quiet for the first time. Lorraine stood in our warm kitchen, the overhead light casting her shadow long and flat against the linoleum floor, 2 toddlers asleep upstairs in their cribs, their soft breaths mingling like a lullaby I would never hear again. She held a suitcase that looked impossibly small for the promise she was delivering. "I need to find myself," she said, voice steady but distant, as though she spoke of someone else's life entirely. I remember her back to me, shoulders squared as she zipped the case closed, promising to send postcards from wherever she landed. The suitcase clicked shut, the sound final. I watched the handle drop, the zipper glide into place, and then I watched the front door swing open under her arm and click shut behind her. The silence that filled the kitchen after that closing click was louder than any argument, heavier than any shouted goodbye. It was the weight of absence settling over me like a shroud. I stood in that silence until our girls woke, and then, from that very moment, I became both mother and father to Alina and Cassidy. Every scraped knee and every hushed cough at 2 in the morning, every school project made from popsicle sticks and cotton balls, every fever that spiked and settled only when I held them close, I carried on alone. I never expected anyone to notice, never asked for applause. I only wanted them to feel safe in a world where their mother had vanished in pursuit of greener pastures she believed lay somewhere beyond our front porch. My job at the mill became more than a paycheck. It became the guarantee of stability, the silent assurance that bills would be paid and meals would be on the table, that the roof would hold even if my own resolve threatened to give way. Weekends found me swapping grease-spattered coveralls for denim and work boots as I patched fences and rebuilt sagging sheds, any extra dollar earned tucked away for braces, school trips, and the occasional treat. I learned to braid 2 ponytails with surprising ease, to assemble birthday cakes that tasted of more than store-bought frosting, to clap the loudest at soccer games and recitals while wearing the same tired smile I'd worn since Lorraine's suitcase closed. Other fathers complained about babysitting. I never complained because I wasn't a babysitter, I was their parent. I carried their lunches to the bus stop, knelt beside the bathtub at night, wiped tears from scraped elbows and from broken hearts, and I kept going, step by steady step. Over the years, I brushed aside the ache in my chest that flared every time a mother was praised at a parent-teacher conference, every time school photographs featured smiling families of 4. I held the image of my daughters in front of my heart and told myself that my love, though silent and unseen by the world, was enough. I watched them grow, their hair lengthening, their voices brightening, their laughter filling rooms I had once feared would echo emptily forever. Some mornings I caught myself still half listening for the sound of that bedroom door opening, for the creak of Lorraine's footsteps coming down the stairs, her bright words and gentle hands brushing my cheek. But those hopes faded, worn thin by years, without postcards, without calls, without so much as a photograph that wasn't brought by Dorian's glossy, foreign frames. The house stayed quiet, until I learned to fill it with my own rhythms, the hum of the washing machine, the drone of a loan tool as I sanded wood in the garage, the deliberate turning of pages late into the night when I read to them until heavy eyes fluttered shut. I realized I had become sturdy, rooted in the certainty that I showed up every day, rain or shine, whether cheers came or not. This house, once empty of her presence, had become a fortress of love built by a father's hands and heart alone. And though the silence of that night 20 years ago still lingered on the edges of my mind, I carried on, learning that sometimes love isn't loud and isn't advertised. It's simply there, unwavering, guiding little lives through a world that otherwise might have swallowed them whole. We weren't rich, but we were stable, an unremarkable balance of steady income and modest needs that suited Alina and Cassidy just fine. I kept my job at the mill, the roar of machinery and the smell of pine sawdust a constant reassurance that tomorrow's paycheck would arrive, and with it the security of roof repairs and groceries stacked high in the pantry. Weekends found me in dusty barns and leaning over weathered fence posts, hammer in hand, patching broken rail or resetting stray boards that threatened to collapse. I carried my toolbox everywhere like a badge of honor, even when braiding my daughter's hair at the kitchen table or tying shoelaces before a school field trip. Through those small acts, each one a stitch in the tapestry of our daily life, I built a world where their childhood felt safe. where absent mothers could be forgiven because every wound was soothed by a father's attentive hands and a father's promise that nothing would ever fall apart under his watch. When other dads complained about babysitting, I laughed it off. Babysitter implied an errand. I was parenting. I had become an expert at sandwich making, at doubling meatloaf recipes to ensure leftovers, at troubleshooting science projects built from empty yogurt cups and colored paper scraps. I learned to host birthday parties that spilled out into the yard, complete with balloons, a rented bounce house, and enough chocolate cupcakes to satisfy a small army of sugar-crazed children. I schlepped to craft stores in the middle of the week because Alina suddenly needed polymer clay for her art showcase, stayed up past midnight drilling holes in wooden birdhouses for Cassidy's school charity auction. I was everywhere I needed to be, always 2 steps ahead of crises I refused to let derail our fragile equilibrium. Lorraine slipped back into our lives every few years like an unannounced comet, dazzling, unpredictable, her orbit brushing us before hurtling away again. She arrived with fragrance still clinging to her coat, eyes bright with the thrill of distant skylines. She'd brandish glossy souvenirs. An Italian leather bookmark rescued from a Florence boutique, a pack of Moroccan postcards stamped in crimson ink, each gift bearing the unspoken promise that she would stay a little longer this time. Alina would run to her with the wide-eyed eagerness of a child convinced that magic can be held in a souvenir magnet or a hotel-shaped snow globe. Cassidy would cling to me, curling her small fingers around my larger ones, her silent question hanging between us. Am I enough? I'd squeeze her hand and nod, as if my calm certainty could barrier her from the sting of disappointment I knew she carried. Behind the scenes, I learned to navigate the undercurrents of single parenthood with a stoic grace I sometimes envied in others. I honed my negotiation skills, securing extra credit for late assignments, convincing teachers to accept a crumpled permission slip, persuading the school nurse that our home remedy soothed fevers as effectively as any generic medicine. I juggled appointments. Pediatricians for one daughter, orthodontists for another, and my own physical therapy sessions to heal a back strain from lifetimes of lifting and carrying. I kept a corkboard calendar in the hallway, tacked with appointment cards, rehearsal schedules, and weekend soccer games. Each sticky note, each scribbled date, was a testament to my resolve. I would not let their childhood slip through the cracks of a life redefined by her absence. In quiet moments, rare as they were, I wondered what it might have been like if Lorraine had stayed. Would we still have quarreled over spilled milk and mismatched socks? Would I have learned to braid hair while holding a hand at the same time? Would my heart have swelled with pride or faded into the background of a couple's routine? But those questions hovered like unsent letters, beautiful and unanswerable, so I tucked them away beneath the layers of morning routines and bedtime stories. There was no room for longing when every heartbeat needed to be directed toward keeping 2 fragile lives afloat. Then came the evenings when the 2 of us sat on the porch swing together, Alina's laughter drifting from her room, Cassidy's final whispers of good night, Dad, lingering in the hall. I'd sip lukewarm coffee and listen to the hush that settled over our small yard, crickets vigilant under street lamp glow, wind whispering through rustling leaves. It was in those moments I felt the full weight of the everyday, the responsibility, the sacrifice, the unsung heroism of a father who carried more than his share. I felt the ache of exhaustion settle into my bones, but also the quiet pride of knowing that I had built something enduring from the rubble of a broken family. I reminded myself that parenting wasn't a role you performed for applause. It was a quiet covenant, reaffirmed with every packed lunch and every gentle kiss on a fevered forehead. So I kept going, forging routines that became rituals, transforming ordinary tasks into acts of love. I braided hair into intricate patterns, hosted birthday parties bursting with childhood wonder, and smiled through nights when doubt crept in. I embraced the weight of the everyday, knowing that under its pressure something precious took form, a home defined not by 2 parents, but by the steadfast devotion of one who refused to let his daughters fall. And in that devotion, we discovered our own kind of normal and imperfect, beautiful rhythm that carried us forward, day by steady day. About 5 years ago, Lorraine returned to our lives not with a battered suitcase or dusty postcards, but accompanied by a man named Dorian Whitlock. I still remember the morning as though it were etched in stone, the way the autumn light slanted through the kitchen window, the low hum of the refrigerator, the regular tick of the wall clock, all interrupted by her voice behind me, soft, almost hesitant. I turned, coffee mug halfway to my lips, and there she stood, immaculate in a tailored coat, her hair pulled back to reveal a face I thought I knew but now studied like a rare, unpredictable painting. At her side was Dorian, tall and impeccably poised, every inch the polished consultant. Sharp suit, crisp tie, gleaming shoes. He looked like someone who'd never woken to the whimper of sick children or washed cereal bowls at midnight. I felt the quiet shift in the air, the subtle rebalancing of a world I'd held together single-handedly for years. Lorraine smiled, that practiced curve of lips I'd once believed was reserved for me alone. "Marshall," she said, her voice warm but reserved, as though we were meeting at a business conference rather than in the kitchen of a home we once shared. Dorian extended a hand, firm and unyielding. "Pleasure to meet you," he said. His eyes lingered on me with polite interest, like he surveyed a puzzle he intended to solve. Our daughters, now in their early 20s, clustered at the doorway, Alina cautious but curious, Cassidy clutching her phone as though it might shield her from an unexpected storm. I studied their faces, looking for the flicker of the child I used to carry on my shoulders, but found instead young women whose lives had moved beyond scraped knees and bedtime stories. The weeks that followed were a dance of introductions and gestures of goodwill. Dorian offered Alina an internship at his marketing consultancy firm, an office bathed in sleek modernity, where she could draft social media strategies instead of filing old tax receipts. Alina, ever ambitious, nodded with the professional composure I recognized, but had only glimpsed in fleeting moments. She accepted the offer with a polite, "Thank you," eyes bright with the possibility of a future I'd never imagined for her in the sawmill shadows. Cassidy, meanwhile, found herself the subject of Dorian's next proposal. He befriended her at a coffee shop, asked about her interests, complimented her on her look and poise, and casually mentioned he had connections at a modeling agency. "You have potential," he'd said, voice smooth as polished marble. Cassidy had laughed at first, my shy girl, accustomed to crayons and paper dolls, then caught her reflection in the window, straightened her shoulders, and agreed to meet with his contacts. She emerged that evening with glossy headshots in her hand, excitement flickering in her eyes like candlelight. Through it all, Lorraine wove herself back into the tapestry of our family. She sent houseplants for the living room, an orchid whose petals seemed to nod in approval, and hosted dinners where laughter filled the air, each toast a polished display of affection. She visited our old haunts, the park bench where she'd first complained about city traffic, the museum where she'd admired Renoir's brushstrokes, the cafe where we once shared cinnamon buns. She brought souvenirs, an Italian leather bookmark from Florence, a Moroccan spice blend in a tiny tin, a photograph of her standing on a rooftop overlooking Casablanca. "Thought you'd like it," she'd say, arranging the items on our kitchen shelf as though nothing about her absence had ever occurred. Throughout her grand return, I watched with the precision of someone who'd become expert at reading small gestures. I watched how Alina lingered in Lorraine's presence, her shoulders unclenching as though she'd finally found a harbor. I watched Cassidy's hesitant smiles bloom into genuine laughter when Lorraine complimented her outfit. I watched Dorian hover, a silent sentinel ready to embellish every story, to offer every opportunity with unspoken strings attached. And I listened for the quiet questions in my daughter's voices. "What took you so long?" And, "Are you really back for good?" I didn't interfere. After 2 decades of solo parenting, I learned the value of patience. I laid low, mending fences only when they snapped, braiding hair with steady fingers, tipping plates into the sink without comment. I watched the tableau unfold. Mother returns, new partner dazzles, daughters orbit uncertainly between hope and skepticism. Every evening, I lay out dinner plates for 4, set a place for Dorian with silverware that gleamed too brightly, and reminded myself that this was their choice. I would not play the villain in a story they'd written without me. On one particular night, I sat at the head of the table and observed every detail, Lorraine's eyes shimmering under chandelier light, Dorian's hand resting possessively on her chair, Alina's poised posture as she recounted her first day in the downtown office, Cassidy's animated retelling of her meeting with the modeling agents. They laughed, clinked glasses, and shared dreams that pulsed with possibility. In that moment, I felt the weight of my own surrender. The conscious act of stepping back so my daughters could craft a new narrative without dragging my shadow along. Yet beneath my calm exterior, a quiet storm raged. Memories of late-night whispers, of bedtime prayers offered solo at 7:30, of lunchboxes packed with perfection, all collided with this slick new reality. The air smelled of unfamiliar cologne and fresh suits instead of spilled juice and bedtime stories. The house, once defined by a solitary father's rhythmic routines, now overflowed with unfamiliar voices and new plans. I'd worked 20 years to build stability, only to realize that stability was as fragile as our family photograph perched on the mantel, its smile now tinged with the uncertainty of whether it still represented us. Still, I remained silent. I strained to hear the echo of my own voice lost in the chattering of progress. I practiced restraint, reminding myself that love sometimes meant granting freedom, even when freedom meant slipping out of your grasp. I reminded myself that my daughters were adults, that Lorraine had every right to return as she chose, and that Dorian, who had never changed a diaper or soothed a fever, could step into a role I had defined with tears and toil. Late that night, when the guests had gone and the clatter of dishes faded, I sat alone at the kitchen table, tracing the grain of the wood with my fingertip. I closed my eyes and pictured the toddlers who once clung to my pants, whose cheeks I kissed before every school day. I thought of the whispered, "I love you, Dad," that used to float through the darkness before sleep claimed them. And I acknowledged, with a quiet ache, that those days were gone. The daughter-ward eyes I once held were now alight with ambition shaped by new hands. The mother who had vanished to find herself had returned, polisher than ever, reshaping our world in her own image. I stood, washed the last cup in the sink, and let the water's steady stream wash away the residue of calm acceptance I had worn all evening. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and tiptoed to bed, ready to face whatever came next. Because though Lorraine had returned upgraded, though Dorian had set himself as our new center of gravity, I still held the most important role of all. I was their father, the man who showed up, night after night, rain or shine, eager or weary. And no suit or consulting firm could ever rewrite that. It was a Saturday afternoon when they came to talk, an ordinary spring brightness filtering through the living room blinds as though nothing momentous hung in the air. Alina arrived first, her shoulders squared in that determined way she'd inherited from me, though her posture carried an unfamiliar weight now. One of hesitation, of rehearsed composure. Cassidy followed, quieter, her gaze flicking between her sister and me, as if seeking permission to speak. Lorraine sat on the edge of the sofa, hands folded in her lap, Dorian standing just behind her like a dark suit of armor. The girls perched on the opposite couch, legs tucked beneath them, eyes trained on Lorraine until she offered them the small, rehearsed smile she perfected in front of hotel room mirrors around the world. I remained standing, arms crossed over my chest, feet rooted in place. The silence stretched taut, waiting to be cut. Lorraine broke it first. "Thank you for having us," she said, voice smooth as glass, betraying none of the impulse I knew must be churning beneath. I watched as Dorian's shoulders shifted, the slight nod of encouragement, his signal that she should continue, that he would catch every stumble. "I wanted us to have a family discussion," she said, "to address some things that have come to light." Her eyes flicked to Alina, who swallowed and took a breath. "When you were young," Alina began, "Mom told us some stories about her life before Dad." Her voice grew firmer as she spoke. "She said there were relationships before you were born. I always assumed you meant old boyfriends, things that didn't matter. But she said there was a possibility, however small, that you might not be Dad's biological daughter." The words landed like stones in my chest. I felt Cassidy shift beside her sister. I knew she was absorbing every syllable with the unblinking intensity of someone who feared the ground might shift beneath her feet. Lorraine's lips parted, as though to explain, but Dorian stepped forward, clasping his hands. "I want to make things practical for everyone's future," he said, tone carefully neutral. "For estate planning, taxes, inheritance, having certainty matters." He looked at Alina, then at Cassidy. "I've offered to legally adopt you both." His words hung between us, a calculated proposal wrapped in the guise of generosity. Cassidy's voice quivered as she spoke next. "It's not personal, Dad. It's just practical. Mom and Dorian want what's best for us." I saw the flicker of apology in her eyes, an apology born of conflict between loyalty and the pull of shiny promises. Alina nodded, reaching out to grasp her sister's hand. "We've talked about it. We've talked to lawyers. It's just a formality, they say. It doesn't change how much we love you." Lorraine leaned forward, her expression warm, sorrowful even. "We know this is a lot. We'd never push you if we didn't believe it was right." Dorian placed a reassuring hand on Lorraine's shoulder, the movement slick and rehearsed. He spoke then, his voice low, persuasive. "We want you to have every advantage. If there's any uncertainty, we can eliminate it." I listened in silence, my throat tight as memory after memory rose in me. Each scraped knee I'd kissed, every lost tooth I'd ceremoniously placed under pillows, Every late-night vigil I'd kept in a chair beside Cassidy's bed when she ran a fever. I remembered Alina's first day of kindergarten, tears streaming as I knelt to fix her crooked bow tie, and the pride I'd felt when she marched into the classroom on her own. I remembered bedtime prayers said alone with my arms wrapped around them, whispering promises that I'd always be there. I had never doubted my place in their lives until now. The proposal itself was absurd, an adoption that would sanctify a patricide of everything I'd built. But what struck me deeper was the implication that after 20 years of unwavering love, I was somehow insufficient, uncertain, incomplete. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I felt the tide rise within me, the years of sacrifice pressing down, demanding recognition. Instead, I walked to the safe hidden beneath the floorboard in my study and retrieved 2 sealed white envelopes, thick and official-looking. Without glancing back, I laid them on the coffee table between us. The room went still. Cassidy stared at the envelopes as though they might explode. Alina's brow furrowed. Dorian glowered, his carefully arranged composure wobbling. Lorraine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I cleared my throat. "These," I said, voice steady though my heart pounded, "are the paternity test results, certified by the court. They were conducted when you were born. They confirm that I am your biological father." I turned and walked away, leaving the room heavy with the echo of that statement and the metallic whisper of unopened envelopes. I felt their eyes on my back, stinging with astonishment and embarrassment, but I continued without pause. I had said my truth. In the quiet of the hallway, I heard Lorraine's sharp intake of breath, Alina's whispered, "Oh," and Cassidy's small sob. I paused at the threshold, listening for the storm I knew would follow, but instead found the hollow silence of realization. I didn't return to their side. I went in my study, closed the door gently behind me, and sat at my desk. The hum of the clock on the wall was the only sound. Outside the window, the day continued, sunlight drifting across the yard, oblivious to the rupture it had witnessed. I didn't need to stay and watch them piece themselves back together. I had delivered my answer. Now it was their turn to live with it. When I surfaced moments later, I found the envelopes unopened, Lorraine's coat hastily tossed on the sofa, Dorian's confident facade gone limp. My daughters sat with empty eyes as though seeing me for the first time. Lorraine met my gaze with a flicker of regret. Dorian opened his mouth, closed it again. Alina's hand crossed to cover Cassidy's, solidarity blossoming between them. The world I knew, balanced on decades of devotion and quiet endurance, tilted on its axis in that living room. And as I stepped toward the front door, I whispered to myself more than to anyone else, this conversation changed everything. Then I walked outside, letting the door close softly behind me, certain that the silence waiting beyond would be filled with a freedom I had long earned. The next morning, sunlight drifted through the curtains like a hesitant visitor, and I woke to a quiet house that already felt different. I padded downstairs in my socks, heart heavy but mind clear, and brewed a pot of coffee without the usual sense of routine. The kitchen table, once a gathering place for laughter and conflict alike, now stood witness to my resolve. Over the years, I learned that sometimes the greatest acts of love involve letting go, and today I intended to set boundaries as firm as any fence I'd ever built. I opened my planner, its pages peppered with faded appointment cards and scribbled reminders, and pinned a list of actions that felt as cold and methodical as inventorying fence posts, yet necessary to reclaim the life I'd long deferred. First, I called Cassidy's leasing office. My voice was steady as I explained that I would no longer cover her rent. The woman on the other end hesitated, then noted the change in their system. I could hear the pause before she ended the call. I set down the phone without bitterness. This was not punishment but declaration. Next, I dialed Alina's cell and asked to remove her from my family plan. I told the customer service representative it was time for her to manage her own line. Minutes later, I hung up, pocket feeling lighter without the weight of monthly bills dragging behind. My fingertips tingled, tasting the unfamiliar freedom of making decisions unbound by someone else's presence. I moved through the tasks as though I were sanding rough edges from a plank, smoothing away the remnants of old obligations. I called my insurance agent to revoke both girls' coverage, health insurance, dental, vision, shifting the responsibility entirely to them. The agent expressed sympathy, but I insisted this was their choice, and I would honor it even as I closed that chapter of my life. Then I contacted my financial advisor. For years, I had contributed to trust funds set to mature when each daughter turned 30, a nest egg for weddings, homes, or emergencies I'd anticipated for them. Now I asked to dissolve the funds entirely. My advisor noted the paperwork I'd need to sign. I said I'd drop by his office before the end of the week. There was no relish in this act. Only a clear-eyed understanding that no child should bind a parent to debts and duties that felt more like chains than love. As I checked off each item, a strange clarity settled in my chest. The air felt more spacious, the walls less confining. I no longer carried the burden of expecting postcards or gracious reunions. Instead, I held the quiet satisfaction of self-respect. With each call completed, I felt the familiar ache of loss, but beneath it blossomed an unexpected sense of relief, as though the years of silent endurance had finally yielded something resembling peace. By mid-afternoon, the tangible work was done. The levers of obligation had been flipped, the pages of my planner updated with a new list: paint the porch, install shelving in the garage, plan a weekend trip with Elise. I poured another cup of coffee and sat at the table, steepling my fingers. The house was empty except for its silence, and I let myself sit in that absence, not as a victim but as the architect of a new beginning. I drafted a single message, careful, concise, and sent it simultaneously to both Alina and Cassidy. You have chosen who fits better. I will not stand in your way, but I will not stand behind you either. Wishing you the best, Dad. I hit send and felt a pang, as though I'd nicked my skin with a blade that cut away any lingering illusions. No venom, no threats, just the sharp truth laid bare. I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and let the gravity of my words settle. It was not anger that propelled me, but clarity. I would no longer be tethered to promises they had abandoned, nor would I remain suspended in the hope of a reconciliation that felt more like manipulation than love. The rest of the afternoon drifted by in a quiet haze. I sorted through a stack of bills, filed away letters, and dusted the surfaces I'd neglected in recent months. With each task, I felt the subtle shift of my identity moving from caretaker to caretaker of myself. I realized how many of my days had been defined by anticipation, awaiting postcards, texts, or the sound of a suitcase rolling across my front porch, and how little remained of that anticipation now that I'd severed those ties. By evening, I was ready for something different. I dialed Elise's number and asked if she'd like to meet for dinner. Her soft laugh on the other end warmed me more than any past memory could. We arranged to meet at a small bistro downtown, the kind of place where candles flicker on linen tablecloths and the clink of glasses punctuates conversation. After closing everything that tied me to my daughter's conditional love, I was eager to open a door to someone who asked nothing but companionship and understanding. I packed a briefcase with the paperwork I'd need to sign for the trust funds and put it by the door. Tomorrow, I'd take care of that final formality and sign with a quiet hand. Then I'd repaint the porch, visit the woodworking group, and explore this new chapter of life where my needs mattered as much as anyone else's. I stood by the window and watched the sky blush with dusk, the first stars daring to emerge. I whispered to myself, as though promising a friend something sacred, "This is freedom." And in that moment, the house, once defined by absence and longing, felt infused with possibility. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped away from the kitchen table that had borne witness to my sacrifice. Ahead lay uncharted territory, new roots to plant, and no regrets to hold me back. For the first time in decades, I found myself waking before dawn not to tend to someone else's needs, but simply to feel the quiet presence of my own thoughts. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds as I stretched, the muscles in my back protesting less than they had in years. In that stillness, I realized how long it had been since I'd considered my own preferences. With a decisive breath, I rose and crossed to the front door, jar of pale blue paint in one hand, brush in the other. The porch boards greeted me like an old friend, worn by countless seasons, and with each stroke, I laid down a new layer of intention. This was my space now, reclaimed and redefined. The fresh color shimmered in the morning light, a promise that the world I'd known for so long could shift beneath my own hand. A week later, I packed a single duffel bag, folded the map of the coast inside its pocket, and set off on a 2-week journey alone. The hum of the mill and the creak of old floorboards were replaced by the rhythmic pulse of highway lines whizzing beneath my tires. I stopped at roadside diners, sampled clam chowder in towns whose names I'd once driven past without notice, walked along empty beaches where the wind carved new patterns into the sand with every gust. At night, I slept in motels with frayed curtains and thick carpet, waking to the scent of brewed coffee and the distant cry of gulls. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't someone's parent or caretaker. I was simply Marshall Crane, man adrift in the vast expanse of his own making. When I returned home, the emptiness felt different. No longer did the silence echo with memories of absence. It resonated with the echo of choices made for me at every turn. I sought out a local woodworking group whose weekly meetings were held in a refurbished barn down the road. The first time I stepped inside, the smell of sawdust wrapped around me like an embrace. Rough-hewn benches lined the walls, each one bearing the handiwork of people who shaped with the way I'd spent years shaping my daughter's lives. I introduced myself and found kindred spirits. Retirees carving decorative bowls, young carpenters designing bespoke furniture, and hobbyists like me who simply found peace in the grain of oak and ash. Under their gentle guidance, I learned to craft a simple stool, trimming and sanding until the edges were smooth enough to cradle the weight of my own reflection. As my hands grew accustomed to measuring and chiseling, I felt a remarkable sense of renewal, not because I was building pieces of furniture, but because I was rediscovering the quiet joy of creation for its own sake. Loose shavings of wood piled at my feet, and I would push them aside at the end of each session, leaving the floor as clear as the space I'd made in my heart to explore new passions. The smell of pine lingered on my clothes, a testament to afternoons spent at the workbench rather than in the echoing halls of familial obligations. And then there was Elise. I met her on a Wednesday morning when I stopped by the public library to return a history book I'd borrowed months earlier but never finished. She stood behind the circulation desk, her soft eyes crinkling at the corners when she smiled, and her quiet laugh sounded like a melody threaded through the hush of bookshelves. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her thoughtful face. She asked if I'd enjoyed the book, and when I confessed that I'd abandoned it half-read, she recommended a new title, something by a local author whose prose danced between poetry and memoir. There was no judgment in her tone, only genuine interest. I left the library with the book tucked under my arm and a flicker of anticipation I hadn't felt since before Lorraine's suitcase closed. Over the following weeks, I found reasons to visit the library more often. Elise and I fell into easy conversation about literature, art, and everything in between. She never pressed for explanations about my past or the hollow spaces in my life. Instead, she listened when I spoke of nothing more personal than a recent chapter I'd read or a woodworking technique I'd mastered. On days when I said little, she offered company in comfortable silence, as if our mutual presence alone was enough. In her quiet company, I discovered how refreshing it was not to carry anyone else's weight or to brace against someone else's expectations. With Elise, I could fold my hands in my lap and simply be. Our friendship deepened over cups of tea in the reading room, where we traded passages that moved us and laughed softly at obscure jokes scribbled in the margins of old texts. She showed me the secret alcove behind the biography section where the light was golden in the late afternoon, and I introduced her to the woodworking group, where she admired the grain patterns of a chest I'd completed. She ran her fingers along the polished wood as though tracing the contours of a well-lived life, and I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with parental pride. One Sunday, after a morning of sawdust and laughter with the woodworking crew, I joined Elise for lunch at a small cafe overlooking the river. We sat on the patio, the water glinting in the sunlight, and she slid a notebook across the table. Inside, she'd sketched a bench design, elegant and simple, a perfect balance of form and function. "I thought you might like this," she said, eyes bright. I traced the lines with my finger and realized the bench was meant to bear more than the weight of its own wood. It was an invitation to build something lasting together. As the weeks stretched onward, I repainted the porch twice more, each coat richer than the last. I fine-tuned the stool until its joints whispered of precision and care. I took trips to antique stores, searching for reclaimed wood whose past stories I could integrate into my own creations. I laughed more than I had in years, not the polite chuckle of social propriety, but deep, resonant laughter that shook my shoulders and filled the room. I slept soundly, dreaming of open workshops and library aisles, of the feel of chisels in my hand and the softness of Elise's laughter in my ear. It was peaceful, this life unburdened by old demands or unkept promises. In the quiet hum of my own newfound routines, I discovered that letting go of responsibilities I never asked for had granted me room to cultivate passions I never knew I had. And as I stood on the freshly painted porch one evening, the sky painted with the hues of sunset, Elise by my side, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I needed to be. The day I learned about Dorian's downfall began like any other. Sunlight stretching through the window, the faint hum of traffic beyond the hedges, and the steady cadence of my own breathing. I was in the garage, smoothing the final coat of varnish on the bench Elise and I had designed, when Jared, my neighbor's boy, popped his head through the open door. He was in his late teens now, lanky and earnest, with a smudge of grease on his cheek and a hopeful grin. "Mr. Crane," he said, leaning against the workbench. "Got a sec?" I set aside the rag and wiped my hands on a ragged towel. "Sure, Jared. What's up?" He glanced around, as though worried someone might overhear. "It's about Dorian's firm," he said, lowering his voice. "Word is, their big merger fell through, and they've been sued left and right. The consultancy's practically insolvent." His eyes flicked to the bench, to the toolbox, any sign of reaction. I shrugged, unclenching the tool I'd been gripping. "I haven't followed his business, son. I'm sorry to hear it." "Yeah," he said, nodding, stepping back. "Cassidy mentioned it at school. Sounds like they had investors lined up. Then poof. Lawsuits, layoffs. The office is shut down." He straightened, swallowing. "Thought you might want to know." I nodded again, masking the surge of something I couldn't name, vindication, pity, a hollow satisfaction. "Thanks for telling me. How are Alina and Cassidy handling it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shifted uncomfortably. "Cassidy's freaking out. Her agency backed out. Alina called you, I guess, but she sounded weird. Said she'd text you later." He offered a wan smile, as if apologizing for the turn life had taken for my daughters. I thought, well, you should hear it from someone. I thanked him, and he left, the garage door rolling down behind him with a gentle sigh. I stood alone, listening to the echoes of his footsteps fading along the driveway, the scent of fresh pine sap and varnish thick in the air. The world outside seemed unchanged. Birds darted among the eaves, a stray breeze rustled the leaves, the distant clatter of a passing car. Yet inside me, the stillness felt charged, as though I'd been handed a question I'd long awaited and now realized I no longer needed to answer. That afternoon, I continued work on a small side table, smoothing its edges with deliberate patience. My mind drifted to Lorraine's polished returns, Dorian's suave assurances, and the way my daughters had once fluttered like birds drawn to the bright promise of a different nest. How quickly they had abandoned the home I built, trading the certainty of a father's unwavering presence for the glitter of opportunity that dissolved like sugar in rain. I traced the grain of the wood with my fingertip, feeling the curve of possibility that comes from shaping raw material into something lasting. I realized then that I, too, was crafting a life unbound by broken promises. Later, as dusk settled and the porch light clicked on, my phone vibrated. I recognized Cassidy's name before the screen lit up. My heart thumped once, an echo of an old hope. The message read simply, "Hey Dad, miss you. Hope you're well." I stared at the words, tasting their emptiness. No apology for the years I had labored alone. No acknowledgement of the paternity envelopes left unopened in my study. Just the hollow echo of opportunity lost. A moment later, Alina's text arrived. "Dad, I heard about Dorian's company. I know I hurt you. I'd like to talk when you're ready." Her words were more substantial, laced with regret and a tentative hope for reconciliation. I felt the old tug in my chest, the familiar ache that once dissolved behind my resolve. But I also felt the quiet strength I'd cultivated over years of standing alone. I set the phone aside and returned to the side table, marking a clean edge where the wood met the sanded surface. My gaze traveled across the garage. Tools neatly arranged, shavings brushing the floor, the scent of polished timber mingling with evening air. I realized that I no longer needed to be drawn into their dramas. I had built a life of purpose beyond the confines of their choices, beyond the tides of their loyalty. I didn't need to check in, didn't need to offer comfort or solutions. Silence, I understood, could be the strongest message of all. Inside the house, I brewed a cup of tea and settled into my favorite armchair, the leather-worn but welcoming. The glow of the lamp cast soft shadows, and I allowed myself to consider their texts again. "Miss you." I smiled at the implausibility of it, 2 words that should weigh heavy with meaning after so many years, but which now felt hollow, like a toy given to an absent friend. I thought of Elise waiting at the library tomorrow, of the woodworking group meeting Wednesday afternoon, of the crawl of new projects that would fill my days. I thought of painting the porch a richer shade of blue, carving a pair of chairs for the back deck, and planning a weekend getaway under open skies. I opened a fresh journal and wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. "They chose who fit better. I will fit myself to what serves me now." Beneath it, I listed plans for the upcoming week. Finished side table. Email library about new book arrival. Join Thursday's woodworking project, step stool. Call Elise to plan weekend. Each item felt like a step away from the past and toward a future I could shape with my own two hands. As I closed the journal, the phone vibrated again, Alina's name flashing. I read her message. If you ever want to meet, I'm here. I let the phone rest on the arm of the chair, unanswered. I didn't need to decide tonight. I had the luxury of choice, built from years of silent steadfastness, years in which I had become more than a placeholder for absent promises. I stood and stretched, the stiffness in my back a reminder of mornings spent leaning over spreadsheets of obligations I no longer carried. I turned off the lamp and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened yard, the silhouettes of old trees standing sentinel. The house felt alive with possibility, each room a marker of the life I'd crafted on my own terms. No longer defined by empty texts or dashed expectations, I felt the thrill of uncharted territory, the quiet hum of freedom I'd earned through sacrifice and serenity. That night, sleep came easily. I dreamed of smooth wood under my fingertips, of book-lined aisles and soft laughter, of open horizons painted in the deep hues of twilight. And when I woke the next morning, I rose not as a man pinned by others' whims, but as a man who had discovered the strength to fit himself to a life of his own choosing. A Saturday morning unfolded with deceptive calm. The kettle on the stove began its familiar whistle, sharp, insistent. Just as Elise slipped out the door, leaving a well-worn poetry book lying open on the couch, I paused mid-sip, the steam curling between us like a signal, and turned to the window, noting how the sunlight danced on the front lawn. Then came the doorbell, a single, trembling chime that carried the promise of disruption. I set my mug on the counter and walked across the kitchen. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, each step a reminder that this house was mine now, that these walls had heard years of laughter, solitude, and quiet reclamation. I opened the door to find Alina and Cassidy standing on the porch, shoulders hunched against an early spring chill. Rain had fallen in the night, leaving their sleeves damp and their hair plastered to their foreheads. They looked smaller than I remembered, girls again rather than the ambitious women who had so recently turned away. Cassidy's eyes flickered between me and the porch floor, as though she feared that looking too directly might shatter the fragile moment. Alina stood beside her, arms wrapped around herself in a gesture of protective solidarity. Neither spoke for the longest beat, and I felt the old urge to usher them inside, to offer coffee and warm blankets. But I waited, curious whether they had come for me or for what I might have lost. Finally, Cassidy's voice broke the silence, raw and unsteady. "Can we talk?" she asked. The words emerged in a rush, as though she'd rehearsed them in her sleep. Alina nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We need to explain." I stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. The storm from their past had arrived at my threshold, and I wondered if I would feel its full force or simply stand firm as I had done so many times before. They crossed the threshold, shedding raindrops onto the welcome mat, and followed me into the living room where Elise's poetry book lay forgotten on the couch. The faint scent of her presence lingered in the air, jasmine and old paper, and I realized how much I had come to treasure these small traces of peace. They sat down opposite me, and for the first time in what felt like years, I saw hesitant versions of the daughters I once held. Alina's fingers traced the edge of her chair, and Cassidy's boots tapped nervously on the hardwood. Lorraine and Dorian's influence felt like a distant dream, replaced now by a vulnerability neither had expected to reveal. Alina was the first to speak. Her voice, though steadier than Cassidy's, quivered with the weight of regret. "Dad, we've been stranded," she began. After Dorian's company collapsed, everything fell apart. The condo payment stopped, and we didn't have the money to cover rent or utilities. We were forced out. She swallowed, eyes dipping to the floor before meeting mine. "Mom didn't come back. Dorian didn't help. We tried calling you, but your numbers were blocked." Cassidy nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks now. "We ran out of options. We ended up couch surfing with friends, or knocking on strangers' doors. Her voice broke. She exhaled, determined to continue. "We realized we made a mistake. We realized what we gave up." I listened without interrupting, aware of the shift in the room's atmosphere. The sun had broken through the clouds outside, casting a bright pool of light across the floorboards. It felt symbolic, a spotlight on the moment we had all been avoiding. Alina reached out and clasped Cassidy's hand, her knuckles white. "We never meant to hurt you," she said. "We thought we were making the right choice. But we were manipulated again, just like you said. We were blindsided by bills we couldn't pay and promises that never materialized." Mom said she'd take care of us, but she left us with nothing. Cassidy looked up, her expression raw. We missed you. We didn't know where else to go. The confession hung in the air, fragile but unmistakable. I held their gaze, feeling a storm of emotions rise within me, betrayal and anger, pity and sorrow, but most of all a weary understanding. Years ago, I had learned to protect my heart by accepting what was and moving forward. Now, I realized that acceptance could coexist with compassion. I stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down a clean blanket. Folding it carefully, I returned to them and draped it over their shoulders, two ragged bundles of humanity seeking solace. You're here now, I said quietly. That's what matters. They both swallowed, clutching the blanket as though it were a lifeline. Alina's lips trembled as she spoke again. Dad, will you let us stay? Just until we get back on our feet. I saw Cassidy's hopeful gaze, the way her eyes glistened like dew, and I remembered every night I had waited for their mother's return, every morning I'd climbed out of bed to tend to them alone. My chest tightened, part grief, part gratitude that they had finally come home. I walked to the door and turned the deadbolt, securing it behind me. The click echoed through the living room like a promise. You can stay, I said, voice steady. We'll figure this out together. They exhaled as one, relief and remorse mingling in their expressions. Alina's eyes filled, tears trailing down her cheeks, and she opened her arms. Cassidy leaned in beside her. I knelt and hugged them both, feeling their bodies tremble against me. The doorbell's echo faded into memory as I guided them toward the kitchen, where the kettle stood ready. I placed mugs on the counter and filled them with warm water, then handed them each a cup. They wrapped their hands around it as though holding on to a second chance. We sat at the table, steam rising between us, and spoke in low voices about the steps ahead, finding jobs, sorting out the condo mess, and unraveling the legal knots Dorian had left behind. But beyond logistics, we talked about trust and forgiveness, about the resilience that had brought us to this moment. For the first time in years, our family felt whole again, not perfect, but real. The rain had passed, and sunlight streamed through the window, warming our faces. In that quiet morning light, I realized that home was more than a place. It was a decision to show up, to forgive, and to build anew. And so, with blankets and coffee warming our hands, we began the slow, uncertain work of rebuilding what we once lost, and, perhaps, discovering something stronger in its place. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Instead, I waited for their confession to finish, letting the weight of their words settle between us like a tide that had finally washed away old footprints. Silence draped the room as I rose from my chair, every inch of me steady, anchored by years of solitary conviction. The girls sat across from me, shoulders slumped, faces pale with relief and lingering fear. Lorraine's absence felt sharper in that instant. No suitcase at the door, no perfume lingering in the hallway, no rehearsed apology on her lips. This was our family now, stripped of pretense, raw in its vulnerability, and it was my turn to speak. I took a slow breath and allowed myself a moment to absorb every detail. The tremor in Cassidy's lip, the tension in Alina's fingers clutching the tabletop, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. I had the power to soothe or to wound with my words. I chose neither. I chose truth. My voice, when I spoke, was calm, measured, but carried the authority of every night I'd stood vigil by a fevered child, of every morning I'd packed lunches and school bags, of every scraped knee I'd kissed better with tears in my own eyes. Did you come back because you missed me, or because you lost him? I asked, gaze unwavering. The question hung like a glass ornament, fragile but unmistakable. Alina's brows knitted in surprise, Cassidy's eyes widened, and I watched the flicker of recognition traverse their faces. No answers came, none were needed. The truth was etched in their posture, in the way their eyes sought mine, searching for the reassurance they had abandoned too easily before. I walked to the sideboard, poured 3 glasses of water, and handed one to each of them before sipping from the third. The cool liquid was a contrast to the heat of the moment, and I let the taste anchor me as I continued. 20 years, I said softly. I showed up every single day. Every scraped elbow, every project I helped with, every PDA meeting I attended, I was here. My voice wasn't heavy with pride, but it carried the quiet conviction of a man who had built a life on consistency. I wasn't perfect, but I was always present. I never left a single Tuesday unwashed, never missed a recital, never skipped a book read at bedtime. You never had to wonder whether I'd be there. I paused, letting my words reverberate through the room. Do you understand what it means to show up, day after day, without applause or notice? Alina's shoulders trembled, and I saw tears glisten in Cassidy's eyes. I didn't avert my gaze. Instead, I let them see the truth in mine. There was never a moment I didn't want you. Every time you chose to walk away, you denied the reality of my love. And when you chose someone else, I let you go because love is an ownership. But I never stopped being your father. My voice cracked then, not from anger, but from the accumulation of every silent sacrifice I had endured. I swallowed and steadied myself. I held your mother's suitcase closed twice, by letting go, and I held your hands through every storm she abandoned you to face. I set my glass down and closed my eyes, recalling the nights I'd sat alone listening for their mother's return, the mornings I rose with aching bones to provide breakfast I ate cold from rushing to the school bus stop. I thought of the trust funds I'd built, the college savings I'd risked, the fences I'd repaired and sheds I'd restored, all in service of them. When I opened my eyes, I saw them looking smaller, humbler, stripped of the confidence that had once convinced them they could trade me for promises they now knew were hollow. You chose who fit better, I said, voice resolute. You fit into their picture for a while, but you never fit here. I was the constant. I reached out and touched Alina's hand, smooth and warm. She flinched, then relaxed into my palm. I hope you understand that I'm not angry anymore. I'm just certain. I moved my hand to rest on Cassidy's, her skin tinged with cold. I won't make you prove your love. I know it's there. But I won't ask you to hold on to a place you abandoned. My thumb traced lazy circles on the back of her hand. If you stay, stay because you want to, not because you need me. If you go, go because you choose to, not because someone else tells you to. Tears pooled in Alina's eyes, and she nodded. Dad, I'm so sorry. I see that now. I never realized how much you did for us. Her voice cracked like fragile glass. I was so focused on what I thought I deserved that I forgot what was always here. Cassidy's lips quivered as she added, I missed you every day, and I made a mistake. I don't want to lose you again. I stood and embraced them both, folding them into a hug that held decades of longing and forgiveness. Their arms tightened around me, as if anchoring themselves to the one place they'd always belonged. I breathed in their hair, their tears wetting my shirt, and I felt my own eyes burn with a release I hadn't known I needed. When we pulled back, I allowed a small smile, gentle but true, to cross my face. Let's start again, I said, voice warm. No more conditions. No more expectations beyond being your father. I watched their expressions shift from apology to relief, the heaviness in their chests lifting. We'll take it one day at a time. I'll meet you halfway. They sat back down, still holding hands, and I returned to my seat across from them. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the room like a benediction. I realized that in asking my question, I had offered them an invitation to choose this family, this imperfect but unwavering home. And in offering it, I reclaimed my own heart from the years of uncertainty. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, not about legalities or logistics, but about life, their jobs, their dreams, the future they wanted to build. I listened and nodded, sharing advice only when asked. There were no grand reunions or dramatic declarations, just the simple restoration of bonds frayed by time and hurt. And as the light shifted toward evening, I felt a quiet certainty settle within me, that sometimes the hardest conversations yield the truest connections, and that love, once given freely and consistently, can find its way back, even through the longest silence. The house was quieter than it had been in years, yet somehow the silence felt different, lighter, almost buoyant. I stood at the window, watching the first blooms of spring unfurl in the garden, petals trembling in the morning breeze. My hands rested on the sill, fingers tracing the worn what I had sanded and stained myself, a testament to the life I'd rebuilt here. No echoes of hurried footsteps, no distant arguments, only the gentle hum of the neighborhood stirring awake and the steady beat of my own heart. For the first time in a long time, I felt a settled peace within these walls. I stepped away from the window and made my way down the hall, passing the spare bedroom where Alina and Cassidy had once sought shelter, warmed by blankets and fresh towels. The door stood ajar, revealing the small desk where Alina worked on her designs, and the framed photograph of Cassidy with her first modeling contract proudly displayed on the dresser. Their presence lingered even in absence, woven into the very fabric of the home we had shaken apart and put back together. I smiled, pride and tenderness rising within me like warmth from the hearth. In the kitchen, I gathered fresh eggs and milk, intending to make omelets for Elise and me. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating the countertops I had replaced after years of wear. I cracked eggs into a bowl, whisking them until they bloomed golden, and added chopped chives, her favorite, and shredded cheddar. As the pan hissed on the stove, I thought of the years I had spent putting everyone else's needs before my own, and of how freeing it felt now to nurture not just my daughters but the life I'd rediscovered. When Elise arrived, she carried a bouquet of daisies she'd picked from the market, white petals bright against thick green stems. She greeted me with a soft kiss on the cheek and an easy laugh that filled the kitchen with warmth. I handed her a mug of coffee, rich and dark, and she settled onto a stool, tucking one leg beneath her. We talked about small things, a new book she'd found in the library's back room, the woodworking group's upcoming project to build benches for the park, the footbridge where we planned to picnic next Sunday. Her words were simple, unhurried, and I realized how much I had missed conversations that centered on nothing more complicated than plans and possibilities. We ate our omelets side by side, the kitchen table strewn with crumbs and laughter. I watched her brush a stray hair behind her ear and marveled at how fully present she was, how graciously she offered companionship without demanding explanations for every chapter of my past. When I told her about my plans to repaint the porch in a deeper shade of blue, she smiled and traced a finger along its chipped edge. "I can't wait to see how it looks," she said. "I'll bring lemonade." After breakfast, I walked out to the porch and unrolled my sleeves. The paint can glinted at my feet, and I felt the familiar thrill of creation tingle through my veins. As I dipped the brush, I reflected on how this place had transformed with every stroke, layers of fresh paint covering weathered boards, much as I had layered new passions and relationships over old wounds. The color bloomed in broad strokes, a vivid declaration that Marshall Crane had reclaimed this corner of the world and his life on his own terms. As the morning wore on, neighbors nodded and waved as they strolled by. Later, I joined the woodworking group in the barn to help craft benches for the town's new park. My hands, accustomed to smoothing cedar and oak, moved with a steady confidence, guiding chisels and sanders as we shaped planks into seats. Each bench carried a piece of my journey. The grit of sawdust on my sleeves, the echo of conversation and collaboration, the sense of contributing to something beyond my own front yard. By mid-afternoon, the benches were drying, and I gathered my tools to head home. The sky was a wash of soft gold, the roses climbing along the fence perfuming the air. I paused at the garden gate, inhaling deeply, and realized that peace, true, deep peace, was less about solitude and more about the harmony of choice. I had chosen myself, chosen community, chosen love, and in return, this life had unfolded with a gentle grace that neither I nor anyone else could have prescribed. Inside, I found a note from Alina on the counter. "Dad, thank you for letting us learn. We're stronger because of you. Love, A." Beneath it, Cassidy's message. "I'm building my portfolio at home. Would you mind if I use the spare room for photo shoots? Love you, C." I folded the notes to tuck into my pocket, feeling a swell of affection and wonder. They had come back, reshaped by hardship and humility, and now approached me not as children seeking comfort, but as adults seeking partnership. I had offered boundaries. They offered mutual respect. That evening, I set 2 place settings on the dining table, one for Elise, one for me. I lit a single candle, its flame dancing softly. We shared a meal of roasted vegetables and grilled fish, recounting the day's triumphs and small joys. The conversation was easy, punctuated by shared smiles and the comfortable silence of 2 people content in each other's presence. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and I realized the house, once defined by absence, now thrummed with life in unexpected ways. Later, as darkness settled, I stepped onto the porch again, joined by Elise and our 2 old dogs, Tucker and Luna, padding quiet at our feet. The porch light cast a warm glow, and I leaned against the railing, cradling a cup of chamomile tea. She slid her arm around my waist, and I rested my head on her shoulder, the rhythm of her breath grounding me deeper than any routine had ever done. We watched the stars emerge, bright pinpricks in velvet sky, and I thought of the prayers I had whispered so many nights for strength and direction. The answers had come not in grand revelations, but in steady days of showing up, in the brushstrokes of paint, in the feel of wood beneath my fingers, in the warmth of companionship unburdened by expectation. I sipped my tea and whispered, "This is enough." She nodded, pressing closer, and I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of daisies and cedar. In that perfect moment, quiet, simple, whole, I knew peace had found me at last. And as the night deepened, I felt the house around me pulse with promise, a home defined not by loss or longing, but by the quiet triumph of love steadfastly given and fully received.